Sign over the house and your savings by Friday, or we're putting you in a home, my son told me, sliding the papers across the table like I was a business deal he was closing. His wife stood behind him with her arms crossed, nodding slowly. I looked down at the documents, then back up at them both, and smiled. "All right," I said quietly. "I'll take care of it." 3 days later, I was sitting on a plane to Greece, and they were standing in an empty house, wondering where their retirement plan had gone. Follow along until the end, and drop a comment telling me which part of New Zealand you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story travels. The papers had arrived on a Tuesday evening. My son Marcus brought them himself, which should have told me everything. He'd never come to the house without a reason that involved money. He was 51 years old and had the kind of confidence that comes not from achievement, but from never once facing a consequence. His wife, Denise, had perfected the art of standing slightly behind him while making sure you knew every word he said was also hers. I was 67 at the time, retired from 31 years working in logistics management for a shipping company based out of Auckland. My wife Carolyn had passed 4 years earlier from a stroke, sudden and quiet, which was very much like her. The house in Napier was ours, mine now, a 3-bedroom weatherboard place on a hill with a view of the bay that she had loved more than almost anything. I'd paid off the mortgage the year before she died. It felt like something we'd accomplished together, even though she never got to sit on that deck and call it done with me. Marcus and Denise lived 40 minutes away. They had 2 children in secondary school, a rental property that never seemed to turn a profit, a subscription box business Denise had started and quietly abandoned, and a habit of treating my house like a hotel they'd inherited rights to. The papers Marcus slid across my kitchen table were from a solicitor I didn't recognize. Transfer of property documentation. My savings account, listed by number. A column for my signature at the bottom of 3 separate pages. "We've been talking to a financial advisor," Marcus said. He had his mother's cheekbones and none of her kindness. "The way things are set up right now, when something happens to you, the estate gets tied up in probate for months. Taxes eat a big chunk. It makes more sense to transfer things now, while everything's clean and simple." "Something happens to me," I repeated. "You know what I mean, Dad." Denise picked up the document closest to her and tapped it with one nail. "It's just practical. You're 67. You can't manage a property on your own indefinitely. And frankly, Marcus and I are already doing a lot of the emotional support work that goes with that." Emotional support work. I had not been aware I was receiving emotional support. In the past 18 months, Marcus had called me 11 times. I knew because I'd started writing them down after Carolyn died dates, what was said, how long the call lasted. 7 of those calls had involved requests for money. The other 4 had been about the rental property, which they wanted me to co-sign a loan to renovate. "And if I don't sign?" I asked. Marcus looked at Denise. The glance lasted less than a second, but it was the kind of look that's been rehearsed. "Dad, we're not trying to make this difficult," he said. "But Denise and I have spent a lot of time researching your options. There are some very good care facilities up in Hastings. Affordable ones. It might actually suit you better than rattling around in this big house on your own." The care facility threat was delivered so smoothly that it took me a moment to process that it had been a threat at all. A very good care facility in Hastings. Affordable. That was the word that lingered. Affordable, meaning basic. Meaning you'll go where we put you if you don't cooperate. I looked at the papers for a long moment. My house. Carolyn's deck. The view she never got to call done. "Give me a few days to look these over," I said. Marcus nodded with the magnanimity of a man who thinks he's already won. "Of course. But the solicitor needs them back by Friday. So don't sit on it too long." They left at 8:15. I watched the tail lights of Marcus's Audi disappear down the hill, Then I sat back down at the table and looked at those 3 pages for a very long time. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because people who haven't lived through something like this sometimes assume you'd feel angry, or betrayed, or devastated. I felt all of those things, yes. But underneath all of it, I also felt something click. The way a lock does when you finally find the right key. Something shifted inside me that had been working loose for a long time. And now it simply fell into place. I was not going to sign those papers. But more than that, I was not going to sit here and wait for Friday. I didn't sleep much that night. By 4 in the morning, I was at my desk with a cup of tea going cold beside me and my laptop open, reading about property law in New Zealand, about international pension arrangements, about whether a man with a valid passport and no outstanding legal obligations could simply choose to go somewhere else and start again. He could. The plan took shape slowly, and then all at once. My superannuation was portable within limits. My savings were my own in an account only I had ever held, in my name alone, established before Marcus was born. The house was mine outright, and houses in Napier, especially on a hill with a bay view, were selling well. I called Patricia Hannigan at 7:15 that morning. She'd been selling property in Hawke's Bay for over 20 years and had sold us the house on the hill originally. I apologized for the hour. She told me not to be silly. I need to sell the house, I said. Quickly. And without fuss. I'll go below market, if I need to. Patricia was quiet for a moment. How quickly are we talking, Arthur? Before Friday, I said. Another pause. That's 3 days. I know. She asked me why. I told her it was a family matter and that I'd explain everything someday over a decent Hawke's Bay red. But right now, I just needed her to trust me and move fast. Patricia had known Carolyn. She'd come to the funeral. She said, "Leave it with me." And that was enough. While Patricia made calls, I spent the rest of that day doing what needed doing. I went to my bank in person and spoke with the branch manager, a careful, thorough woman named Sandra, who I dealt with for years. I told her I was relocating overseas for health reasons and wanted to transfer the bulk of my savings to an international account I'd be setting up upon arrival. Sandra walked me through the process without drama. There were forms. There were verification requirements. It took most of the afternoon. But by 5 o'clock, the framework was in place. Marcus called twice that day. I let both go to voicemail. His messages were variations on the same theme, just checking in, wanting to make sure I'd had a chance to look at the paperwork, hoping we were all on the same page. The second message had an edge to it that the first one didn't. Nothing overt, just a tightness in the voice. The sound of a man who expected things to go his way and was starting to wonder if they might not. Patricia rang me back the following evening. She'd found a buyer, a couple relocating from Wellington who'd been looking for something with a view and had the finance pre-approved. They'd seen photographs and were prepared to move quickly. The offer was 11% below what I might have got with a proper campaign. But it was cash equivalent, clean, and it would settle by Thursday afternoon. I told her to take it. The closing documents arrived by courier the next morning. I signed them at my kitchen table, in the house that Carolyn and I had loved, looking out at the bay. Then I drove to a travel agent on Emerson Street. I did it in person deliberately, paid cash, and I booked a one-way flight to Athens, departing Friday morning at 6:15. From Athens, I planned to continue to Crete. I'd looked at Crete years ago when Carolyn and I were dreaming about retirement travel. Warm, affordable, quiet. A man my age could live well there for a long time on what I had. On Thursday afternoon, the settlement came through. By 4 o'clock, the house was no longer mine, and my accounts held more money than I had ever seen in a single number. I withdrew what I needed in cash for the short term and transferred the rest to the international account I'd arranged with Sandra. Then I packed one suitcase, Not because that was all I could take, I had time for more, but because I found that when I actually stood in front of my wardrobe and my shelves and tried to decide what mattered, very little of it did. A few good shirts, photographs of Carolyn, the book she'd been reading when she died, which I'd never been able to bring myself to finish, but also never been able to leave behind. My father's watch, the good walking shoes. I called a charity that Carolyn had supported and arranged for the rest of the contents of the house to be collected the following week. I left the keys with the new owner's solicitor. At 9:15 Thursday evening, I sent Marcus a text message. It said, "The house has settled. Funds are secure. Don't look for me, and please don't contact me again." Then I switched off my phone, put it in the kitchen drawer of the now empty house that was no longer my house, and walked out to the car. I was at Auckland Airport by 5 the next morning. I sat in the departure lounge with a flat white and watched the dawn come up over the runway. I felt, for the first time in 4 years, like I could breathe all the way down. The flight to Athens was long. I don't mind long flights. Carolyn used to say I was the only person she knew who actually enjoyed them. The enforced stillness of it, the sense of being between one thing and another. She was right. I ordered a glass of wine somewhere over the Indian Ocean and raised it to no one in particular, or maybe to her, and watched the dark water 30,000 feet below and thought about how much of my life I had spent worrying about other people's problems and calling it love. Crete was everything I'd hoped it might be. I found a small apartment in a village called Vamos, up in the Apokoronas region, white walls, a courtyard with a lemon tree, mornings that smelled like thyme and warm stone. The woman who owned the building was in her 70s and asked no questions beyond whether I was a quiet person who would pay on time. I told her yes on both counts. She handed me the key. For the first 10 days, I slept properly for the first time in years. I walked in the mornings. I sat in a cafeteria in the village square and drank coffee and watched the light move across the hills. I began, slowly and badly, to learn a few words of Greek from a small phrasebook I'd found in a shop in Chania. The locals found this charming rather than embarrassing, which I took as a good sign. I had been there 11 days when the first message reached me. Not on my phone, I'd left that behind. On my email, which I checked occasionally from a tablet I'd bought at the airport in Athens, the message was from Marcus. He'd found the address through my bank. Apparently, or rather, through a private investigator he'd hired once it became clear that I'd actually, genuinely, completely left. The message was long and moved through several registers. It started with concern. It moved into hurt. By the third paragraph, it had arrived at accusation. He said I had acted irrationally. He said selling the house without consulting him was a form of recklessness that raised serious questions about my state of mind. He said he and Denise were worried sick. He said there were legal avenues available to families in situations like this, and that he was exploring them. That last part I read twice. Legal avenues. Situations like this. I knew enough about New Zealand law and had done enough reading in those sleepless nights before I left to understand what he was gesturing at. There were provisions under the Protection of Personal and Property Rights Act that allowed family members to apply for welfare guardianship or property management orders in cases where an older adult was deemed unable to manage their own affairs. The threshold was not as high as people imagined. A sudden, unexplained liquidation of assets. Departure from the country without informing family. Erratic behavior. A solicitor willing to write the right letter to the right court. I closed the tablet and sat in my courtyard with the lemon tree for a long time. Then I opened it again and started searching for legal representation. Her name was Elena Stratakis. She was recommended to me by a man I'd met at the Cafenean, a retired British solicitor named Jeffrey, who'd been living in the village for 7 years. And who turned out to be one of those people that life produces occasionally. The right person in the right place at exactly the right time. He'd seen me reading something on my tablet with the expression of a man working through a problem he didn't want to have. And he'd simply said, "Anything I can help with?" Elena had offices in Chania and specialized in international family law, with a particular focus on cases involving older adults and cross-jurisdictional disputes. She was in her mid-40s, precise and unhurried, and she let me talk for 40 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands on the desk and looked at me steadily. "Your son is correct that there are legal mechanisms available to him," she said. "But using them is not simple, and the bar for success is higher than he probably realizes. Greece and New Zealand have no formal agreement on reciprocal guardianship enforcement. Any application he makes in New Zealand would need to be recognized here, which requires a separate proceeding in a Greek court. That process typically takes months." "So I have time," I said. "You have time. But more importantly, you have something better than time." She leaned forward slightly. "You have a clean record, a coherent explanation for your actions. And if what you've told me is accurate, substantial evidence of a pattern of financial pressure that preceded your departure. That context matters. A man who sells his house and moves to another country because he wants to is exercising his legal rights. A man who does so because he was being coerced into signing over his assets is a man who deserves protection, not intervention." She asked me to provide everything I had. Bank records, the timeline of financial requests from Marcus over the years, the dates and amounts, the property transfer documents he'd tried to get me to sign, any written communications. I had more than I'd expected. Those 11 months of notes I'd kept after Carolyn died, the dates, the calls, the amounts turned out to be exactly the kind of documentation a lawyer looks for. I'd kept them without quite knowing why. Maybe some part of me had understood for longer than I'd admitted. Elena filed an emergency protective declaration with the Chania District Court on my behalf, establishing my legal residency in Greece and documenting the circumstances of my departure from New Zealand. She also sent a formal letter through international channels to Marcus's solicitor advising them that any further attempts to contact me or to initiate legal proceedings in New Zealand would be contested, and that a counter-complaint for elder financial abuse and harassment was being prepared. 2 days after that letter was sent, the emails from Marcus stopped. The silence should have been a relief. In some ways it was, but it also had a specific quality to it. The silence of someone who is regrouping, not retreating. I'd known my son for 51 years. He did not give up easily on things he believed were owed to him. I was walking back from the market one morning about 3 weeks after I'd arrived, carrying tomatoes and a loaf of bread, when I saw the car. A rental, parked outside the courtyard entrance. Marcus was leaning against it with his arms folded. He looked like he hadn't slept. He looked, in fact, like a man who had flown from Auckland to Athens and driven 3 hours to a hill village in Crete, and was now standing in the morning sun, wondering whether this was the moment he'd finally gone too far. Denise was not with him. I stopped on the path. We looked at each other. "You look well," he said finally. The words came out strange, like he hadn't planned them. "How did you find this address?" I asked. "Private investigator tracked the car hire from Athens." He paused. "You paid for that? With your card?" I had. A small oversight in an otherwise careful plan. I filed it away. "You need to go home, Marcus." "Dad." "No." I said it quietly, without heat. "You've had your say in emails. I've read them. I understand you're upset, but this is my life, and I am living it in the way that I have chosen. And there is nothing in any law in New Zealand or Greece that gives you authority over that. Elena's details are in the letter she sent your solicitor. If there is anything further you want to say to me that isn't through legal representation, I would suggest you think carefully about whether it's the kind of thing you want on record." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mum would be upset It was a calculated thing to say. He'd always known where to press. But here, standing on a stone path with tomatoes in my hands and the smell of thyme in the air and Carolyn's photograph on my bedside table inside, it landed differently than he'd intended. "Your mother," I said, "spent 38 years watching you treat people's goodwill like it was a resource to be extracted." She never said so out loud, but she didn't have to. I knew her well enough to read the silences. I let that settle. She would want me to be at peace. I am at peace. Goodbye, Marcus. I walked past him into the courtyard and closed the gate. He stood outside for another 20 minutes. I know, because I could see the shadow of the car through the courtyard wall. Then I heard the engine start, and he drove away. Elena moved quickly after that. She filed the counter-complaint as promised, a formal complaint to New Zealand's Adult Guardian Office, documenting the financial pressure, the coercion, the attempted property transfer, and the intimidation implied in the care facility threat. She also lodged a formal harassment complaint with the Greek authorities regarding Marcus's unsolicited appearance at my residence. The process that followed took 4 months. I won't describe every step of it because the legal machinery of these things is grinding and slow and largely undramatic. What I can tell you is the outcome. The New Zealand Family Court reviewed Elena's documentation alongside the counter-complaint and determined that my actions in selling the property and relocating were consistent with the rational decisions of a competent adult who had reasonable grounds to believe his financial security was under threat from family members. The application Marcus had begun drafting for a property management order was rejected before it was even formally filed. The Adult Guardian's Office opened an investigation into the pattern of financial requests made of me by Marcus and Denise over the preceding 4 years. The total, once it was properly documented, came to just over $380,000 loans that were rarely repaid, emergency funds that were never mentioned again, contributions to the rental property renovation, money given under the kind of pressure that stops just short of a name. Marcus and Denise were not charged criminally. The threshold for financial elder abuse in New Zealand requires a higher degree of intent than could be established from the records alone. But the investigation itself and the formal findings meant that they had to engage with the reality of what they'd done in a way they'd never had to before. Their solicitors' fees alone were substantial. The record existed. If they ever tried anything similar again, it would be there. I received one final message from Marcus, 4 months after he'd stood outside my courtyard gate. It was brief. It said he and Denise were going through a difficult time, that he'd been speaking to someone, a counselor, I gathered, and that he was sorry for the way things had happened. He did not ask for anything. He did not suggest we reconcile. He just said sorry, in the plain, unelaborated way that someone says it when they finally mean it, rather than when they're deploying it as a tool. I read it 3 times. Then I closed my email and went and sat in the courtyard with my coffee. I am 68 now. I've been in Vamos for just over a year. My Greek is no longer embarrassing, still not good, but functional enough to have a real conversation about the weather and a vague one about politics. The woman who owns my building has become something like a friend. Jeffrey and I play chess on Tuesday evenings and argue about things that don't matter. I've started walking the coastal paths on the weekends, sometimes 6 or 7 kilometers at a stretch, and my knees have mostly forgiven me for the decades I spent at a desk. I thought about Marcus's apology for a long time before I decided what to do with it. In the end, I wrote him a reply. Not warm, exactly, but honest. I told him that I understood something about how people become the way they become, that patterns get established early, and the people who love us sometimes make it too easy to stay inside those patterns for too long. I told him that I took some responsibility for enabling, for years, the dynamic that had eventually become untenable. Not for everything, but for some of it. I told him I didn't hate him, that I hoped he found a way through whatever he was working through. But I also told him that reconciliation, if it ever came, would have to be built on something different from anything we'd ever had before, and that I had no way of knowing whether either of us was capable of that, and that I was at peace with the uncertainty. I didn't hear back. Maybe I will someday. Maybe I won't. Either way, I got up the next morning and made coffee and sat in my courtyard and watched the light come through the lemon tree, and I was grateful, genuinely, quietly, all the way down grateful for the stubborn, frightened, improbable courage it had taken to get here. If you are watching this and you are in a similar position, if you have people in your life who treat your savings as their safety net and your home as their inheritance waiting to happen, I want to say something clearly. Your assets, your home, and your retirement are yours. Not partially yours, not yours, unless family needs them. Yours. Adult children are legally and morally responsible for their own financial lives. Under New Zealand law, the Protection of Personal and Property Rights Act exists to protect people like you, not to give family members authority over your choices. If someone is pressuring you to sign documents, to transfer property, or to make financial decisions you haven't arrived at yourself, that is not family concern. That is coercion. There are legal protections available to you. And there are people, lawyers, advocates, the family court, whose job it is to help you use them. And if everything else fails, and you find yourself sitting across a kitchen table from someone sliding papers toward you and talking about care facilities in a tone that is not quite a threat, but is not quite. Not one either. Just remember that you have a passport and that the world is large and that it is not too late to begin again. I started over at 67. The lemon tree is flowering. The coffee here is extraordinary. It turns out that peace, once you clear enough space for it, is not that hard to find.